Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So we are continuing to discuss narrative today. We can talk a little bit about the reading from last week. I'll also give you a preview of the readings that we're going to be doing this week. I wanted to give you guys kind of a wide variety of different kinds of narrative. So we started back in week 2 with a nonfiction example of narrative from John McPhee, The Search for Marvin Gardens. That's all pretty much real stuff that McPhee either did or observed. He's also relating some history in that particular piece. So that's a good example of how narrative can function in a non-fictional context, which means, the stuff is real, but we still have characters. We still have a lot of those other elements of narrative that we talked about last week. So we have interesting settings. We have some examples of, characters, conflict. There's a plot. There's actually multiple levels of the plot, as I've mentioned. So just another piece of evidence that whether we're dealing with a fictional narrative or a non-fictional narrative, we're going to be looking at a lot of the same ingredients, a lot of the same basic elements will be at work. So this week, we're going to turn our attention a little bit more to fiction. So our official reading for the week is a short story called Real Women Have Bodies, written by Carmen Machado, kind of a contemporary, celebrated writer who's working right now. And we're also going to take a look at a couple of other pieces that I've linked you to in the week 3 module. So for these other examples, you can just listen to them. I've given you some links to readings like audiobooks, essentially, but they're short stories, so it's not going to be as time consuming as listening to an entire novel. Instead, you can get a couple of additional short stories. One written by Diaz, a pretty popular piece. He's a pretty well-known writer, still active today, called Fiesta 1980. And then the other piece, you can really pick either of the two if you don't have time to listen to both. You can do both, or you can just pick one. The other one is called Ziggurat, written by Stephen O'Connor, another American short story writer. Pretty contemporary, pretty recent, maybe about 10 or 15 years old. So those are the two pieces that we're going to be doing sort of as optional, additional experiences if you have the time. I'd like you to at least listen to one of the two. And if you're interested, you can do both. But our required reading that I've posted in PDF form for this week is Real Women Have Bodies. So these are all short stories. These are all works of fiction, all written by pretty popular short story writers who are working right now. So we're going to see a lot of those same elements of narrative that we've been talking about. But let's talk at least briefly about The Search for Marvin Gardens, because I know it was probably a bit of a difficult read for some of us. It's probably not the type of text that we would typically sit down and read perhaps on our own if it wasn't assigned for class. So if you struggled a little bit with it, if you found it to be a bit confusing and difficult at times, that's okay. It is kind of a strange piece. John McPhee's a little bit strange just as a writer. And the way that he chose to structure that particular essay or article, however you want to look at it, or if we could call it creative nonfiction, because as I've mentioned, McPhee is often thought of as one of the creators of what we now call creative nonfiction. Regardless of what it is, it's definitely, regardless of what label we want to give it, it's definitely a narrative. But it's a multi-tiered, multi-leveled narrative. And that's something I was asking you guys to think about and to try to, talk about a little bit on the discussion board back in week 2. So just to clarify, in case we're still a little bit uncertain, Let's just go through some of the different levels of the plot that McPhee is giving us here. So, on one level, McPhee is telling the story of a game of Monopoly that he himself was playing against a friend. So McPhee was a competitive Monopoly player. That's kind of a fun trivia fact about him. He loved Monopoly. He played a lot. I think he even entered into competitions where he could play for money. So he's telling the story of a sort of one-on-one Monopoly game that he was playing against somebody he knew. I'm not sure if it was a friend or just a familiar opponent, somebody he had played against before. But he's also using the events of their game to tell us a little bit more about Atlantic City, New Jersey. So in case you weren't able to figure this out from your reading or from some Google searches, the game of Monopoly, the actual board that you see when you play, was based on the real city in New Jersey called Atlantic City. So a lot of the places in the game are real places, or at least they were. A lot of that stuff might be gone now, but it was all based on the real geography and the real locations of Atlantic City, New Jersey. And many of you might know Atlantic City. It's kind of a famous place. I've never been myself. Maybe some of you have visited. It's a popular destination for gambling. They have lots of casinos there, but it's also just a popular resort because it's on the coast. So you can go to the beach. There's lots of nightlife, and it's been like that for a long time. It's been kind of a popular tourist destination, and it continues to be. So he gives us some history of Atlantic City. But he also wants us to know a little bit more about the history of the game, the history of Monopoly, the creation of the game, but also the creation of Atlantic City. So we get a lot of history about the real place and about the game that is based on the real place. So he's mixing in the history along with the more sort of present tense narratives of his Monopoly game. And you might have noticed that McPhee is also walking around Atlantic City. That's literally what the title refers to. He really is searching for the Marvin Gardens, the property that appears in the Monopoly game and was also a real place in New Jersey, and he's trying to find it. And as we notice, he's having some difficulties finding it. But he's very interested in how the game sort of intersects with real life, and how the Monopoly board that he's so familiar with lines up with the actual lived reality of people in these real places. So that's kind of what he's doing, in case you were confused. And you might notice this is really a great example of a narrative that you need to read more than once. Because once you kind of figure out what he's doing, once you figure out his strategy, you can go back and read it again, and you'll find that it's much easier to follow once you kind of fill in some of these blanks and you have a better idea of what he's actually doing in the text. But you might notice the way he transitions from one level of the narrative to the next level. So often when he lands on a particular property in the game that he's playing, he then jumps into the real history of that place in Atlantic City. So, for example, at one point during the game, he lands in jail. So if any of you have played Monopoly, you know that's something that can happen during gameplay, but he takes that opportunity of landing in jail. Of course, that's figuratively speaking. He's not really in jail. It's just what happens in the game. But he takes that opportunity to then transition to an actual jail, the real jail in Atlantic City that he visits. during his travels. And then he describes what it looks like, what he sees, what's going on. So that's a strategy that he uses more than once. He uses the gameplay as a way to get us into the real place, the real properties, and his real travels as he's walking around, talking to people, and making lots of observations. So one thing you might notice from his observations, from his traveling, is that in the 1970s, when he wrote this, the piece came out in 1972. So at that time, Atlantic City had fallen on hard times. It had become a very economically disadvantaged place. And he's noticing that. A lot of these lavish hotels and fancy properties that were featured in the game have kind of become decrepit, dilapidated, they're falling apart. A lot of them would eventually get demolished because they were old and falling into disrepair. So he notices that. He notices that a lot of places in Atlantic City are, frankly, rough, like they're struggling. The people who live there are also going through some hard times. So he's not just interested in the properties, he's interested in the place overall and what it's like in 1972 compared to what it might seem like or look like on the Monopoly board. But again, he's also giving us some history of the place. So we know that when Atlantic City first got started, they had lots of expensive stuff. It was pretty fancy. Wealthy people would go there to vacation. There were big, beautiful resorts, really nice hotels, lots of money. But he wants us to understand the changes that have occurred, right? Atlantic City was riding high earlier in the 20th century, but by the 1970s, things have changed. It's lost a lot of that money, and things are not going great at that particular time. So he's sort of observing that, and that's what makes Marvin Gardens an interesting property, because it's one of the few properties in the game that isn't found within the city limits of Atlantic City. As he kind of figures out, by the end of the piece, you have to leave the city to actually find Marvin Gardens. And you have to go to kind of more of a suburban sort of outlying community, which is pretty nice. And I think there's kind of like a gated or walled community. They're kind of separate from Atlantic City. And things are pretty good there, but very different from what he saw in the city itself as he was, traveling and talking to people. So that's kind of what he's doing. He's giving us history of Atlantic City, the history of Monopoly, but also he's relating his present tense experiences in Atlantic City while also narrating the game of Monopoly that he's playing against this familiar opponent. So when people first read this, especially if they don't know anything about Monopoly, they don't know anything about Atlantic City, it can be confusing, right? Like, what's going on? What is he doing? Why is he talking about Monopoly? Why do we care that he's playing Monopoly? But once you realize the different levels, you might be able to start seeing the relationships between those different levels of the narrative. He's clearly trying to tell us something about the real place and about what's happened to the real place and the people who live there. And also he wants us to see the difference when he finally locates Marvin Gardens. It's different from the other places that he's seen, right? So I'm going to leave it up to you guys to determine what his narrative point or overall theme is, but he definitely has one. And in the style of many good writers, whether they're doing nonfiction or fiction, he's not interested in just announcing his theme. Right? He doesn't have to package it and deliver it in a really simple way. He wants us to figure it out for ourselves. And I think we can. So it's a fun piece, and we'll actually come back to it a little bit next week when we start talking about descriptive language and the power of description, because there's some really good descriptive passages in this text that we can look at as examples of what description can do for a narrative. A narrative is often only as successful as its descriptive language and descriptive details. So we can kind of return to it when we're talking about that next week. But a few things I wanted us to maybe focus on a little bit this week as we continue to read more narratives. Let's think more about character development, character motivation. Why do characters do the things that they do? Why do they feel the way that they feel? Why do they say the things that they say? That's always a good sort of, treasure chest of things to explore when you're reading a narrative. Why are the characters in the position that they're in? Why are they doing the things that they do? And that's going to help you to move beyond just plot. Now, we talked about plot last week as a really central element of any narrative. Any narrative will have some form of plot, the actual narrative events that are transpiring, the stuff that happens. All narratives have those. But one thing I've noticed through teaching this unit in many 101 classes over the years is that lots of students get too hung up on the plot. They're really sort of only focused on making sure that they understand the plot, making sure that they understand what happens, right? And often, we know this, we can find good plot summaries of pretty much anything that we're assigned to read online. If it's been assigned in any class at any point in time, there is a summary somewhere out there on a website waiting for you to find it, read it, maybe pay for it. And now with ChatGPT, you could probably get a pretty good plot summary just by asking ChatGPT to spit one out for you. And yes, to some extent, knowing the plot, it is important. And we do need to make sure that we understand the major narrative events and why they're significant, how they connect to one another, and how they lead us to the conclusion of the story. But there's a lot more to narratives than just plot, right? There's a lot more than just understanding the basic narrative events. And if we only focus on plot, we're going to ignore, or at least not consider enough, all of the other elements that make narratives fun, interesting, enjoyable to read, but also those other elements are going to be important to consider when we're trying to figure out the theme. See, this is where students sometimes run into trouble. When they're only focused on plot, they're sometimes unprepared to really interpret the overall narrative point or theme of the story, because all they really know is what happened, right? So if you're just focusing on what happened in the search for Marvin Gardens, that's not going to really get you to where you want to go, because you have all of these apparently disconnected events. The dude's playing Monopoly. The dude's in jail at one point. He's in jail. He's walking around. He's talking to people. He's giving us history about other people and a place in New Jersey that we may or may not know is connected to Monopoly. So if you're just focusing on the events that McPhee writes about, that's really not going to tell you what McPhee's overall point or theme really is. You're just going to have all of these disconnected events, and you don't know what they all add up to. You don't know how they're all working together to express the message or the meaning that McPhee wants us to understand. So we have to dig beneath the plot. We have to do more than just make sure we can produce a decent plot summary. Right? Because some narratives have plots that might not be super eventful. A good example is Fiesta 1980, one of the examples of narrative I've posted for this week. So again, you can just listen to that one. And I really encourage you to listen to it because the speaker, the guy that reads it, is really, really good. And he really inhabits the voice of the main character, Junior, in the story. So if we're just thinking about the plot of Fiesta 1980, I mean, it's really not super eventful. It's just a family going to a party in the Bronx, and along the way, we learn some troubling things about the main character, the protagonist, the narrator's father, and what the father's been up to. So things happen. There are several events, some of them involving nausea and food and the party and the relationship between different family members. But if we're just thinking about narrative events, we might sort of be bored, right? They go to a party, the son finds out something about his father, the father's kind of mean to him, and then they go home. Like, that's that's pretty much the plot if we're just thinking about major events, right? But there's a lot more going on the level of character, on the level of dialogue, on the level of theme. And of course, the setting is important as well, but it's really a character study. Fiesta 1980 is really more about people and less about plot. I mean, there is a plot. There's always a plot. But the story's really more focused on these individual characters and what they're going through, how they feel, particularly Junior, our narrator, who is also, of course, like I said, the main character, but he's telling the story. So this is a great example of first-person narration. We also see first-person narration in Machado's short story, Real Women Have Bodies. In the other example I posted, Ziggurat, written by Stephen O'Connor, we get a limited third-person narrator. Okay, so our narrator does not appear to be one of the characters in the action. So we don't get the I and the me pronouns. Instead, the narrator of that piece stands kind of apart from the major narrative events, and the narrator is just relating those events to us, the readers. But you'll notice if you listen to Ziggurat, which is also an audio piece, I believe it's it's read by Tim Curry, a British actor who you guys might recognize if you look him up. But you'll notice that the third person narrator is limited. It's not necessarily an omniscient narrator. The narrator doesn't seem to know everything, but the narrator does know what the Minotaur is thinking and how the Minotaur is feeling. But notice the Minotaur is not telling the story himself. We have a third-person narrator telling the Minotaur's story. Okay? So notice the difference between those narration styles. Now, I would say that Ziggurat has more of a sort of compelling, complex plot, but it's still more about character. It's more about the Minotaur and the new girl. And yeah, the narrative events matter, but character matters more. So I really want us to think this week about our characters. What is going on with them? Why do they think the way they think? Do what they do, say what they say? How do we learn things about them? How do we get to know them? How is information about them provided for us? And how do we feel about them? Ultimately, that's always important to think about as readers. The other thing I wanted to mention this week, it's just kind of a fun little extra bonus thing that we can look at or watch if we have time. I actually posted this in week 2, but I've reposted it here in week 3. Just a brief clip from a TV show on PBS. You don't have to watch the whole show. It's just about a 5-minute clip from this guy, Rick Steves. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He has a show on PBS where he basically travels and talks about the different places that he visits. And in this particular episode, he goes to some old caves in France where they had discovered these really intricate, really sophisticated cave paintings that were done by prehistoric people literally cave people. We don't necessarily use that term anymore, but these are prehistoric people, kind of pre-civilization. But we've learned over the last several decades that they had pretty sophisticated artistic techniques when it came to painting images on the walls of the caves where they spent a lot of their time. But what's really interesting, if you watch that clip, Steves is going on a tour, and he's talking to the French tour guide about the actual images, the actual paintings on the walls. And the guide points out that what you're mostly seeing are the three major animals that would get painted by these prehistoric people: horse, ox, and deer. And Steves asks a pretty logical question. He says, well, so this is just like a hunting scene, right? This is like the kinds of stuff that these people would have seen when they were hunting. But notice the tour guide's answer to the question. First of all, I like how he sounds a little bit frustrated with Steves. That might just be his French accent. But he says, no, it's not a hunting scene. In fact, none of what you see inside the caves would really be considered an exact depiction of real life. And the way the guide knows that is because there's no people. Nowhere in that cave are there artistic representations of people. You only see animals. So the idea is, if it was just a hunting scene, you would see people, the actual hunters, pursuing the game. But you don't see that. So what the tour guide concludes based on that is, this isn't just a reproduction or a replication of what these people saw on a regular basis. As he puts it, they never tell the everyday life. In his kind of broken English, he says they never tell the everyday life. What they're doing is more complex. The hunter does not exist on the walls. The hunter is never seen. So what does that mean? Well, a lot of historians and anthropologists will argue that what these prehistoric people were really reproducing would be their dreams. Not what they saw in real life, because in real life they would have seen lots of other humans. But what they were sort of trying to express were their dream states, what they dreamt about. And that's what they were painting on the walls. Now, I'm not sure why they never dreamt about other people, but there's lots of evidence that suggests that, yeah, this is a sort of higher level of storytelling. They're not just saying, hey, yesterday we hunted some deer. Here's what it looked like. Instead, these are more sort of complex visions. These are more complex stories. So that's the reason I posted these. We might be thinking, well, it's painting, right? It's not the same as writing. It's not the same as the kind of narratives that we're looking at. But think about what a lot of art, even visual art, does, right? It tells a story. So these ancient prehistoric cave drawings are telling stories. But like the tour guide says, they're not simple stories of everyday life. They're stories of the inner workings, the interior states of the people, what they dreamt about, what they imagined, right? Maybe some of it was based on reality, but a lot of it was based on imagination. So even in this prehistoric setting, we have storytelling, we have narrative, right? We don't know the exact nature of these stories. We can't really get back to thinking the way those people thought or, fully understanding their artistic vision. But we know that they were telling stories. They were telling narratives, and they were pretty complex narratives, even back then. If you guys are interested in cave paintings, I would recommend a movie called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. This came out it's a documentary, it's not a fiction film. It's a documentary came out maybe between 15 and 20 years ago, directed by a German filmmaker named Werner Herzog. And it's really cool because they take a film crew into a lot of these caves in France, maybe even the same one that Steve's is in, I can't remember, but they go to a few different ones. And they are able to actually record a lot of this art, and they're talking to local experts. They're learning more about the art and what it might have meant. And again, in most of those paintings, they don't see people. They see a lot of animals. They see a lot of different scenes. Some of it might have been connected to like fertility rituals. They also find some like little figurines and like statues, some of which seem to depict women who are pregnant. So there might have been some fertility stuff. There might have been some very early like religious rituals connected to this. But they really find how sophisticated a lot of these prehistoric artists were. In the Herzog film, they discover that they had a way of depicting motion. They would use the ridges of the cave walls. So you guys probably know that cave walls are not completely flat, right? They have ridges, they have hollows, they kind of, are convex and concave at different points. So they would use the shape of the walls to depict movement, motion. So if they wanted to show animals running or jumping, they could use the actual shape of the cave walls to do that, almost like really prehistoric comic books, or the way we sort of do like stop motion animation. So, kind of cool, not terribly essential if you don't have the time, but if you find the cave paintings interesting, you could certainly check out the movie. But the point they're all sort of trying to make to us is that storytelling, whether it's in, oral form or, visual art, later it would appear in writing, that impulse, to tell stories, to express our dreams, to express our imaginations, that's been around since the very beginning of mankind. And of course, the techniques change, the artistic technology might advance, but we always have this real compulsion, this need to tell stories. To tell the stories of our own lives, but also to tell the stories of the things around us. To tell stories of everyday reality, but also to go beyond everyday reality. To tap into our dreams, to tap into an imaginative world that might be very different from everyday reality. But always there's a point. Always there's a purpose behind the expression. And just it's helpful to remember that we've been doing this for a very long time. Okay, so we'll keep this lecture short because next week we're going to have a lot to cover with description. So the final thing I'll leave you guys with, just a couple of hints. I don't want to give too much away about the Machado short story because you're going to be answering questions about it this week on the discussion board. But one thing to notice in Fiesta 1980 and Ziggurat, notice some of the elements that we were talking about last week. Not just the styles of narration, first person versus third person, but also notice that Diaz in Fiesta 1980 is playing around with the plot sequence. So remember, we talked about the major narrative events. That's the plot. That's what happens. But then there's a plot sequence, right? How are those major events arranged? How are they presented to the reader? So it's a pretty straightforward story, but you'll notice that the main thrust of the narrative is the family going to this party in the Bronx. They're leaving their home in New Jersey and they're going into the city for a party, for the fiesta, right? As the title tells us. So that's what most of the plot consists of. But as you're listening, notice that our narrator, who is Junior, the main character of the story, he jumps back in time. We have a couple of flashbacks or maybe even flash forwards. It's not always completely clear. But when he starts telling us about his father and a particular woman that his father knows. That's leaving the main chronological sequence of the party, right? So when he ends up at this woman's house in New Jersey, that happened previously. And then later, when he's talking to his brother about what they've learned about their father, that probably happens later, right? So he jumps back in time. He jumps forward in time. He leaves the party to tell us other things that have happened. And again, they're important to know because they tell us a lot about Junior, about his brother, Rafa, and, of course, about his father and the larger sort of family dynamics that are going on in the story. So notice that Diaz plays around a little bit with his sequence, and he's not always following a strictly chronological progression from first to last, right? And then with Ziggurat, I thought you could maybe think a little bit about the mixture of realism and fantasy. So O'Connor does some interesting things with like this ancient Greek myth, which is very old, and he's using certain elements from the myth. But then he also kind of modernizes it with stuff like beer and pool tables and even just the way the characters talk. So it's this really interesting mashup of old and new, but also realistic and sort of fantastical. We might think of it sort of surreal in many ways. And lots of people enjoy fantasy and sci-fi narratives. Some of you might sort of be into that stuff. So O'Connor might remind you a little bit of a more kind of a fantasy sci-fi realm. But there are a lot of everyday realistic details. Whereas Diaz is really working within a genre that we would call realism. Right? And some narratives are like this. They are really just trying to capture everyday life. Okay, so not what we see from the French tour guide, but it is what we see from Diaz, right? He's not giving us any flights of fancy or sort of fantastical, mythical elements. He's giving us stuff that is very recognizable as realistic, everyday details. But also, he's very much interested in capturing the experience of Dominican Americans living in New Jersey and New York in the 1980s, because that's his own experience. Diaz grew up in New Jersey. Diaz is Dominican American, right? So he sprinkles in lots of Spanish. He sprinkles in some slang terms that would have been used by that particular immigrant group to try to capture what life was like for them. What did they eat? How did they talk? Where did they live? Right? He talks about the New Jersey Turnpike. He talks about the Bronx. He talks about specific locations, much like McPhee does. Right? So if you don't recognize any of those places, look them up. Take a look at a map. And again, listen to that one because Felix Solis, who's the one reading it, is an actor, also from New York City, so he has the right voice, the right intonation, the right style to really capture Junior, our first-person narrator. Whereas Tim Curry, our reader of Ziggurat, kind of captures the humor, but also the surreal, almost frightening quality of Ziggurat. So very different stories, very different styles, but they both have some of these essential narrative elements. So enjoy those. You're not being tested on those. But when it comes to Real Women Have Bodies, pay close attention. Make sure you're taking notes. Make sure you're underlining, annotating. You might have some questions. Write those down. And you'll also notice that Machado, like O'Connor, is sort of combining realism with what we might think of as science fiction or even horror genres. There's some weird, scary stuff going on in that story, but there's also some very mundane, everyday details that make us feel like we're in a real place. So a lot of contemporary writers do that. They take some elements from fantasy, some elements from realism, and they combine them to create something interesting and new. So if you have any questions about this week's about all of the narratives that we're looking at this week, I've also posted some other brief examples that you can take a look at if you have time, commercials. A final thing you can think about just as additional examples of narrative would be songs. I would recommend thinking about a song that you like. Just something that, you're fond of as a fan, as a music listener, and then go and try to find the lyrics to that song. Most songs are narrative in terms of their structure, in terms of how they're packaged, and how they're presented. Even songs that seem very simple, they are usually telling a story. So find a song that you like, read the lyrics, and see if you can start to imagine it as a narrative with characters, a setting, a plot, and some larger narrative point or meaning that you should understand by the end of the song. All right, so enjoy the narratives this week, and I'll see you next week as we get started on description.